This episode is brought to you by Early Innings, an anthology of the first 4 years of the Twin Bill. Featuring over 200 pages of baseball poetry, short stories, essays, interviews, comics, and art, it tells the story of what it means to love baseball today. The Athletic's Tyler Kepner said, like a box of ballpark Cracker Jack, there's a delightful surprise on every page of the Twin Bill's Early Innings. This is a collection to be savored, a loving and lyrical celebration of the art of baseball. Early Innings is available now from 406 Press. This episode is also brought to you by Ben Shahan's Short Relief. It asks the question of what happens when men are not ready to give up that boys' game, the national pastime. In 9 stories, he traces the stories of a minor league pitcher holding on to his last shred of hope for promotion to the show, little leaguers' formative experiences, and a host of men and boys in between. Short Relief is out on 406 Press and available at 406press.com. Welcome to the Twin Bill Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Bolohan. There are so many important days in baseball history, and Phil Coffin digs deep into some of the most important ones to find stories that even the most diehard fans won't know. In a baseball book of days, he picks 31 of these moments, covering topics as varied as Jackie Robinson's debut to the spitball. And it's packed full of fascinating pieces of baseball history. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Phil. How you doing today?
Doing just fine, Scott. I'm glad to be here talking baseball.
So I always like to start off by asking, where does this idea for the book stem from? Where did you first get this idea?
Well, this book, like my first book, When Baseball Was Still Tops, did not really start out as a book. Both of them started out as essays I was writing for baseball buddies, just for fun, for myself and for them. And I would I would have a topic and I would write and I would share it with them, and instant gratification. After the first book was published and I started with the essays that now are part of a baseball book of days, I saw after a while that there was a connection here, that these individuals or these events, they could be very easily tied to a specific date. And so I thought, well, baseball's calendar goes year round. Baseball fans think about baseball year round. So we can make a calendar of events, of people, of players. And so that's how I came up with this sort of advent calendar of baseball, where you have, here's a date and you have an event or a personality that is tied to that date. And here's another date and the same thing. And so what we have here is a compilation of 31 of those. And the title may oversell the book a little bit when I say transform the game, because they didn't all transform the game, but they're all fascinating stories about baseball. And baseball engenders stories in a way that I think most sports do not. And I think that's one of the great attractions of baseball and of baseball history, that there are just stories that even people who know baseball well, who like baseball, they go, I didn't know that. And a lot of the stories that are in the book, even though I know baseball pretty well and I have been following it for a long time, I would come across something and I'd say, I didn't know that. And so I would begin to research it, and it became a chapter.
This was my experience reading the book, is that we would come across something in the book and I was like, wow, I want to look more into this. It's sort of like the ultimate rabbit hole book. And I have a feeling that that's kind of what your research process was like in some way as well.
Well, absolutely. Funny that you mentioned rabbit holes. When I wrote my first book, I would tell my wife every night after dinner, I said, well, I'm going upstairs and going down some more rabbit holes. And so she started calling the project Bunny Ball because of all the rabbit holes. So yes, my research process tends to be rabbit holes. I find some little nugget, and in many of these chapters, there's a familiar story, but I find things that I didn't know or that are sort of tangential, or you pull the thread on your sweater and boom, suddenly you have something that's totally different. And it's kind of fun to see those extra elements to the stories, some of which you know and some of which you never have heard of.
There's so many great examples in the book here. I think we can start with one that people are pretty familiar with. Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier.
Yes.
I was shocked to read some of the newspaper articles and how they treated that day, and how it really wasn't it didn't seem like as monumental of an occasion as we now treat it.
Well, you're exactly right, Scott, and that the papers did not treat it as the monumental thing that we see now, where there is this definitive line of demarcation in baseball. You have baseball up to April 15th, 1947, and you have baseball after that. And it's very firmly defined right there. And we see it that way. But it wasn't addressed that way at the time. And I think part of that was because society, newspapers did not want to address race in an overt way. In the newspaper articles that you go back and see from April 16th, there are allusions to it. And some articles did make the reference to the fact that he was the first black player. Some correctly actually said he was the first black player since 1884. Others just said he was the first black player. And so there are mentions of that. But many of the articles, as you know, don't mention it at all. And for the most part, the articles, when they did mention Robinson, it was well into the story. It would be like the 6th or 7th paragraph. So there was nothing to indicate that, wow, this is a big day, unless it was a sideboard or a columnist. The game stories themselves did not give you that sort of sense. But I'm not sure that the public at the time really regarded it that way either. 1947 Dodgers were an excellent team. They came into the season with great expectations. In 1946, they had lost the National League pennant in a playoff. So they were really, really good. Expectations had to be high. Fans had to be excited. And yet here on opening day at Ebbets Field, the stadium was only 80% full. It's a 68-degree day. There's no rain. Ebbets Field has 20% of its seats are empty. And I was really fascinated by that. It really struck me as very unusual because here's an excellent team. And everybody knew the Jackie Robinson story, and yet they didn't even come close to filling the stadium. So I thought that was very intriguing. We all know the story of the game itself, just in its basics. But I got thinking, it's Jackie Robinson's first game, but opening day is an important day for everybody in the game. So who else was in that game? And so that's what led me to take a look at the lineups that day and the benches who played. And who were these guys? And there are 33 players who were in that game. And as a reflection of the game at the time, 14 of them were born in the South. One of them being Jackie Robinson himself, who was actually born in Georgia before his family moved to Pasadena, California when he was young. But that's very much what baseball was like at the time. You had a game that was filled with Southerners. To show you just how Southern the game was, one of his teammates was named Dixie, and one of the opponents was called Bama. So very much a Southern flavor in the national pastime. So having Dixie Walker, who was a very well-known player, one of the best players on the Dodgers, be a part of that. He famously did not want to play with Robinson, and eventually the next year was traded. I got to think, well, how many Dixies were there in baseball? Another rabbit hole. And there were a dozen guys called Dixie who played in the major leagues. What I found curious was that two of them were named Dixie Howell, and they were born the same year, both born in Kentucky, and they actually were teammates for part of the season in the 1950s. One of the Dixie Howells was a pitcher and one was a catcher. So for a few games, you had Dixie Howell pitching to Dixie Howell, which must have confused baseball editors and typesetters everywhere. But curiously, the last Dixie Howell to play in the major leagues was in 1958. And it's 1 year later when baseball finally fully integrates, when the Red Sox bring up Pumpsie Green. So you have this history of Dixies, and it ends just about the time that baseball fully integrates. So I thought that was an interesting little connection there.
Yeah, you started to mention, I was going to go on a slight tangent, or maybe in a little rabbit hole here. Two other players that you write about in the book, Pumpsie Green and Ozzie Virgil. These are two guys that I know the names. I have a rough idea. What can you say about Pumpsie Green and Ozzie Virgil?
Pumpsie Green was the first player to integrate the Red Sox in 1959. And in many ways, he should not have been. He was a sort of a nondescript middle infielder who came up after the Red Sox had a tortured history of not integrating. They had famously had a tryout for Jackie Robinson back in the 40s, as well as Sam Jethro, who later became a Rookie of the Year, and a fine player named Marvin Williams. And it was a sham. They had no intention of signing him. During the tryout, somebody up in the stands yelled out a racial slur, "Get those off the field." And nobody's ever known definitively who it was. There has been speculation that it was the owner, Tom Yawkey, that it was the manager, Pinky Higgins, that it was the general manager, Joe Cronin. Whatever, it sort of set the tone or reestablish the tone of the Red Sox. The Red Sox had a chance to sign Willie Mays in 1949. They sent a scout to take a look at the young Willie Mays in Birmingham, and it rained, and the scout didn't want to wait around to watch black players, although that's not how he referred to them. And so he sends in this very unenthusiastic report, and the Red Sox, who had right of first refusal on players from the Birmingham Black Barons who played in the same ballpark as the Red Sox minor league team, the Birmingham Barons. They don't sign him. And can you think what the Red Sox might have been? The Red Sox basically were mired in mediocrity for much of the 50s. If they'd had Jackie Robinson, if they'd had Willie Mays to go with the other players they had, I mean, it's astounding what they could have been. In 1954, they could have had an outfield of Mays, Ted Williams, and Jackie Jensen, who would become a league MVP. But this was not their approach. They actually had signed a couple of black players. They'd signed a black player named Piper Davis. But again, it was kind of a sham. They released him early in the season rather than paying him an extra $7,500. And they'd said all along, well, we can't find any good black players, and it's not cost effective to spend money on these black players. While at the same time, they were shelling out lots and lots of money for white amateur players. Finally, they signed Pumpsie Green, and they also signed a player named Earl Wilson as a catcher, but they convert him to a pitcher. And it's only through happenstance that Earl Wilson does not become the first black Red Sox player. He serves in the military, and it doesn't work out. So he comes up a couple of weeks after Pumpsie Green. Well, Pumpsie Green finally comes up, but only after the manager, Pinky Higgins, has been fired. Higgins had said that no blacks would ever play for him. As long as he was the manager, there would be no black Red Sox. And he was right. And 2.5 weeks later, Pumpsie Green is on the field.
Similarly, Ozzie Virgil. What can you say about Ozzie Virgil?
Ozzie's an interesting story himself. Ozzie was the first player from the Dominican Republic to play in the major leagues. There had been Latino players for many years. I think the first Cuban played in the 1880s or 1890s, and slowly you get to Latino players coming into the game. The Dominican Republic, where baseball was extremely popular, does not send anybody to the major leagues. Virgil himself was born in the Dominican Republic, but he moved as a kid to New York City and played there, and he played sandlot ball. Ultimately, he signs after a lengthy tryout with the New York Giants, and ultimately he ascends to the major leagues, and with no fanfare whatsoever, becomes the first Dominican player in Major League Baseball. And the Dominican didn't suddenly, have a gusher of players because Ozzie Virgil had come in. People said, oh my God, there must be a great pipeline of talent, because he was a marginal player and his circumstances, Dominican, New York, it didn't just say, this is the place to tap for talent. It was really only after the Cuban embargo in the early 60s that there was more of a move to get Dominican players. Before that, Felipe Alou, an excellent player who the Giants signed, he was signed in the late 50s. So you had a slow introduction of excellent Dominican ball players. And then in the 1970s, when the Cuban pipeline has been shut down in the 60s, baseball is always looking for cheap talent. But you had a couple of guys who were Dominican who developed rudimentary baseball academies that sort of primed and prepared young Dominican ball players to be signed by the major leagues. And it took some time, but they had great foresight. They knew the talent. I mean, the Dominican Republic it's half an island. Its landmass is not that big. Its population is roughly the size of North Carolina. And yet now, almost 11% of major leaguers are Dominican. So it has taken almost 70 years. You've gone from Ozzie Virgil to 1 in 9 ball players in the major leagues is Dominican. It's a fascinating arc that no other country outside the United States has taken.
Yeah. He's someone whose name I think that more people should be aware of. He seems like
it's interesting because David Ortiz, for one, a great Dominican ball player, really has said that for Dominicans, Virgil they should think of him as their Jackie Robinson.
On a completely different note here. Spitballs. I knew spitballs were banned. I did not know this crazy thing that I learned in this book, that teams were allowed to designate spitballers after it was disallowed. This blew my mind here. As you point out in the book, this would be like letting steroid guys, letting McGuire, like, all right, McGuire, Sosa, you can keep juicing. That's fine. How did this happen? This is crazy to me.
Well, it is crazy. I mean, there had actually been a push for a long time to ban the spitball, and it had not been a really big push, but there had been talk about it. For one thing, the spitball really was a factor in the dead ball era. The spitball really had been tinkered with some in the late 1800s, and in the early 1900s, it really comes to the forefront. You have some pitchers who really know how to throw it. Ed Walsh, Jack Teesbro, and they're fantastic. And the hitters can't hit it. When the splitter came into to baseball several decades ago, pitchers who threw it, Mike Scott, nobody could hit it. And the spitball was like that. And offense in the early 1900s just plummeted. Baseball owners like to make money, and they eventually realized that, as exciting as these 2-to-1 baseball games are, the fans much prefer offense. And so that is one of the driving factors of getting the spitball out of the game. There were concerns it was unsanitary, and in some ways it's kind of cheating, and especially after they banned the spitball. So they in 1920 they banned the spitball but with caveats. And then 1921 they have this list. There are 17 pitchers who are grandfathered in. They were major leaguers, had been throwing the spitball. Now they can continue to throw it as long as they're in the major leagues. If you were a minor leaguer and threw the spitball, you were out of luck. And there was a guy named Frank Schellenbach who had been sent back to the minors, who wound up winning almost 300 games in the minors throwing a spitball, but he couldn't use that in the major leagues. So he had this minor league career. Anyway, in the major leagues, you have the 17 guys, and some of them are ordinary, but some of them are really good. And some of them are Hall of Famers. And so the spitball continues to be used by some of these players going into the 1930s. I think Burley Grimes threw the last official spitball in 1934. So this is 14 years after the spitball has been officially banned. You still have a guy out there throwing it. So it was a long path to find eliminating it, but it finally, at least legally, left the game. And then it actually was pretty much out of the game. There were always a few players, but it came back illegally a little bit more so later on. In the 1950s, there actually was some push by baseball officials. Ford Frick, the commissioner, one of the league presidents, they thought it would be wise to bring back the spitball because they were concerned that there was too much offense in the game, which show how much they knew.
Well, look at the outcry over the Spiders tax stuff, where the pitchers were really pushing for, use the grip stuff. Yeah, I get it. I think as long as there's baseball, people are going to try to figure out a way to get an advantage in whatever way they can with the baseball there.
Right. I mean, one of the interesting things about the ban of the spitball was that they didn't just ban the spitball. They banned defacing the ball in many ways, whether it was scuffing the ball or using slippery elm or tobacco juice, all sorts of things. There was a thing called the shine ball where a pitcher would rub the ball on his pants and he would get a smooth spot, and that would change the flight of the ball. All these things were banned, but unlike the spitball, they were not grandfathered in. Only the spitball was grandfathered in, which I find a very interesting sense of morality in 1920. Is these ways of cheating we're not going to allow that at all, but this one we're going to allow for a few more years.
Yeah. So when I was a kid, I remember seeing Field of Dreams, and I thought, oh, Moonlight Graham, that's the only guy in history who, never had an at-bat. Turns out that's actually very far from the truth. There's a couple dozen. If you were going to put your Kinsella cap on here and you were going to create a story about one of these Moonlight Grahams, are there any of them that really stand out who have a great story to you?
Yes. Moonlight Graham, as you're right. In 1905, he plays one game for the New York Giants, plays a couple innings in the field, never gets to bat. So his line in the baseball encyclopedia back in the days when there were actually these printed books, it was one game and I think 16 or 17 zeros. Bill Kinsella, a Canadian author, sees this in the baseball encyclopedia and is fascinated. And he's fascinated by the name Moonlight Graham. I mean, his name was actually Archibald Graham, but Moonlight Graham is just such a great baseball name.
It's a good name, yeah.
So Kinsella researches and he finds out the backstory of this guy who who never plays after this one game where he never, it's like having an ice cream cone, but they take the ice cream out and all I have is the cone. That's what it's like that have one game in the majors but no time at bat. Kinsella researches this, finds out he becomes a doctor in a small town in Minnesota, writes a fabulous novel called Shoeless Joe, and then Shoeless Joe is made into the movie Field of Dreams. So Moonlight Graham, who nobody's ever heard of, now everybody who knows baseball has heard of Moonlight Graham. And I, like you, thought, well, how many Moonlight Grahams could there possibly have been? And how many? Well, there could have been 62 of them, not counting pitchers who I thought, you could clearly pitch in a game and not get to bat. And I was amazed that there were so many. But the one I really liked was a catcher for the Pirates named Sam Brennigan. And again, many of these guys were from the early part of the game. Brennigan was a sort of a good hit, no field catcher who finally gets his chance in the major leagues. And he comes up and he gets into the game late in the game and he allows a pass ball and he really doesn't chase after it. And it splits his finger. So he's got a little bit of an injury. And the funny thing is that for years after this, having a split finger like that was called having or suffering a Brennigan. Here's a guy who plays in one game, but he gets an injury named after him. There's later another pass ball that he doesn't hustle after. He doesn't go after a wild pitch. And the manager says, enough of this, and pulls him from the game. And that's the end of Sam Brennigan's major league career. And I loved it. The headline on one of the articles after he was cut or sent back to the minors says, loafs himself out of major league, which, he was.
Yeah.
And another headline said, he was too lazy. Catcher Sam Brennigan released by Pittsburgh. And so it captures this guy. Well, he continues playing the minors, continues to hit, continues to be very lackadaisical in the field, and he just keeps playing his way down the food chain, getting chances until he's out of the game. And when he's finally out of the game, he says, the devil must be in me and everything is going wrong, which, even at the end, Sam Brennigan could not take accountability for what he was doing or not doing on the baseball field.
A name I had never heard of before, Don Padgett. Very interesting story. One I never would have found if it wasn't for your book. Who's Don Padgett?
Well, that's what I asked. I was researching something else and I stumbled across something that mentioned Don Padgett hitting .399 in 1939. I mean, I didn't watch baseball in 1939, but I know the era kind of, and I thought, how could I not have heard of a guy who hit .399? So I went and looked it up. Hitting .400 was not terribly unusual at the time. The last player to hit .400 was Bill Terry in 1931. So for baseball fans' memories, there are a fair number of .400 hitters. So Padgett comes along, and in 1939, he's hitting the heck out of the ball. I mean, the problem is that he's almost Sam Brennigan as the defensive player. He's a terrible catcher. He had been a bad outfielder, and they had converted him to catcher to try to get him on the field. The Cardinals' outfield was full of excellent players, so he just was not going to crack that outfield. But he's bad enough that his manager won't run him out there every day, and he's hitting .400 all season. He has a couple injuries along the way, but he's a part-timer. We get to the end of the season, and the funny thing then is that there were no official qualifications for the batting title. We now know that you have to have X number of at-bats per game to qualify for the batting title. But back then, there was nothing. It was sort of unofficial, like, well, you got to play 100 games to win the batting title, maybe. So he's not even going to do that. He's going to be in the 80s. But he's still hitting .399 going into the last game of the season. Even now, his manager does not start him in a game that is meaningless. He's going up against a pitcher he has owned. He has the platoon advantage, and still he doesn't start. Finally, late in the game, the manager puts him in to pinch hit, and lo and behold, Don Padgett strokes a single up the middle. Boom! He's a .400 hitter. The umpire had called time because the ball had rolled out of the bullpen onto the field. Oh, no pitch. Padgett comes back to the plate, still has a chance, except the pitcher walks him. And thus ends his chance to hit .400, and he's a .399 hitter forever.
Great. Wow. So this is going to come out on August 18th. And on August 19th, Eddie Gaedel, a guy who I think that everyone here, I assume every listener here has heard the name Eddie Goodell before. I did not know his life story. I did not really know the story of that game. What can you say about Eddie Goodell?
Well, we talk about Jackie Robinson's first game being momentous. We can talk about Eddie Goodell's only game, and it was momentous, but in a far more farcical way. Bill Veeck had bought the St. Louis Browns, the worst team in baseball. They were proving it on the field. They couldn't win. They couldn't draw. Veeck, marketer that he was, is looking for a way to try to draw some crowds to Sportsman's Park in St. Louis. And so he comes up with this idea that for a doubleheader on August 19th, 1951, he brings in Eddie Goodell to sign him as a player for the Browns. Now, Eddie Goodell wasn't a ball player. He was sort of an entertainer because he was 3 feet 7 inches tall. And so, that's short, but how short is 3'7"? If you think about it, like a 36-inch bat, which players don't even use something that big anymore, but a 36-inch bat was pretty common then. Well, that's only like 7 inches longer than Eddie Goodell was.
Yeah, the Babe. That was the size of the Babe's bat.
Yeah. So Goodell is signed, and Veeck asks him to simulate a crouch because Goodell is not really a ball player at all. And Veeck decides that this is great because Goodell has about a 1-inch strike zone. Now, he also understands that he can never get a contract for Goodell officially approved by the league if he just sends it in. So he sends it in at night before the game. It's on a weekend, and so it's there. The league office has it. It's official. So the next day, in the second game of the doubleheader, is going to be the big reveal. Well, what the fans thought the big reveal was going to be between the two games. They had gotten this big cake made, this cardboard or wooden cake, and Goodell is dressed in a baseball uniform with number 1/8 on the back, and he's going to jump out of the cake between the games. They have promoted the heck out of this game, and the Browns actually drew 18,000 people, which was miraculous for them. They never drew that many people. And they had billed it as it's the 50th anniversary of the American League, which was true, and it's the anniversary of our big beer sponsor, which nobody knew whether it was true or not, but it made a good marketing pitch. And so Goodell comes out of the cake, and people are going, "That's it?" So the game 2 starts, and the Browns are in the field for the first half inning, and they come to bat. And their leadoff hitter is a guy named Frank Sauché, who could have been a really good hitter, but he suffered terrible shoulder injuries. And he actually comes back to the Browns only because Veeck has asked him to. And he tries to get in shape, and he's taking so much batting practice that his hands are bleeding. He really can't even grip the bat. And his shoulder is so bad, he can't throw the ball, but he's out in right field for the top of the first. So he comes to lead off, but he's not going to bat. So they announce, now batting Eddie Goodell. And Goodell strolls out with 3 little bats on his shoulder, number 1/8 on his back, these teeny tiny baseball cleats on his feet. And the umpire goes, "What the hell?" The opposing manager goes, "What the hell?" And there's jawing back and forth. And the Browns manager comes out, shows the official contract, and the umpire says, "I got to let him bat." And so Eddie Goodell goes to bat, all 3 foot 7 inches of him. And the pitcher is a guy named Bob Kane, who walked batters all the time anyway. And now he's got to throw to the smallest man in baseball history. His catcher, and the picture you can find of this is hilarious. The catcher, Bob Swift, is on his knees. And of course, Goodell walks on 4 pitches. Now, Veeck had sort of threatened Goodell about, "Don't swing the bat. I'm going to have a sniper in the ballpark just in case." Because although he never acknowledged that this was the case, some years earlier, James Thurber had written a short story called "You Could Look It Up," in which a very short player comes to bat, the same sort of circumstances. He swings the bat, hits the ball, and a very little man takes a very long time to get to first base. He gets thrown out. And Veeck has this fear Goodell will pull the same thing. But no, Goodell takes his 4 balls, walks to first base, and now they send in a pinch runner for him, Jim Del Singh. Goodell pats him on the butt and trots off the field, and that's the end of his baseball career. After this, the league office says the contract is null and void. So it's a funny story, except that he didn't lead a funny life. Goodell, he'd always been taunted as a kid because of his height. He had a drinking problem. His family said that when he drank, he had beer muscles, and he would get in fights in bars. And he's 3'7". He's not going to win them. And about 10 years later, he's living with his mother in Chicago, and he goes out to a bar, and he gets into it with some guys in a bar who are mouthing off. And they beat him up outside the bar. And he gets home, and his mother finds him dead in bed the next morning. And thus ends the sad life of Eddie Goodell. And the one coda to this, which I find at least a little uplifting, is that Bob Kane, the pitcher who had walked him, had always kept in touch with him, sent Christmas cards to Goodell every year. And he was the only player or only person from Major League Baseball who went to Goodell's funeral. Wow. And I just thought that was a magnanimous gesture on the part of a guy who didn't have to.
I got two more questions for you here. I'm going to try to put you on the spot a little bit here. Is there a day in baseball history that you wish you could have witnessed?
Wow. I
told you I was putting you on the spot.
Yeah, that is a good one. I think it might be October 3rd, 1951. And that would be at the Polo Grounds when Bobby Thompson hit the home run to win the playoff game and the National League pennant. The Polo Grounds was such a bizarre stadium. There's everything on the line. You have all these great players in the game. The tension must have been unbelievable. And to see the home run, it didn't go that far because it was only like 250 feet down the left field line at the Polo Grounds. But it must have been just an unbelievable game to watch with everything that was at stake. Then, that kind of an outcome, you just really can't see an outcome like that every century.
Yeah, you did pretty good with that one. I got one more. You're on the spot again.
Okay.
Do you have a favorite day in baseball history that you did witness?
That I did witness?
That you did witness, yeah.
Yes, and this is totally crazy. It has really nothing to do with baseball. But this was in 1992 at Fenway Park. It's September. The Red Sox are going nowhere. They're playing the Mariners, who are going nowhere. The game it's just a game. I'm there with a buddy who lives in Hartford. Midway through the game, somebody comes out of the stands, jumps on the field, and runs out to second base. This is between innings. And second baseman is Jody Reed. And no security guys come to get the guy off the field. And the first baseman's there with a ball in his hand. And Reed takes the glove off his hand, gives it to the fan, and points to the first baseman, throw him a ground ball. So the first baseman does. And the guy makes a not a very good throw. And of course, it's Boston. The crowd boos. But it's kind of funny. Now security comes to get the guy off the field. Well, this is kind of funny. Well, the next inning, two more guys come out of the stands, leaping across the dugout onto the field. And they're running around the field for quite some time before security gets them off the field. A couple more innings go by. Now some woman in a very tight dress ambles over the very low barrier there to get onto the field. And she walks out like she's going to go out to one of the players. She's like the middle of the first baseline. And now a security guy comes there. Now we're going to stop somebody. And it's a heavy-set security guy in a tight polo shirt. And he runs out after this woman who's in heels and just, got a funny walk because she's wearing this unbelievably tight dress. And just as the security guy gets to her, he loses his footing and takes her legs out from under her. And, of course, the crowd just boos the guy like crazy. But everybody gets up and they take her off the field. And so that is my most special baseball game.
I love that so much. That is about the best answer I could have hoped for there. Fantastic. The book is great. I guarantee, this is a Twin Bill podcast guarantee, no matter how big of a baseball fan you are, you will learn something from this book. It is just full of incredible stories, incredible moments, and it really dives deep into things that I thought I knew what there was to know about it, but I really didn't. The book is fantastic. Thank you so much for the time, Phil. This was great.
Thanks. The book is available, A Baseball Book of Days, from McFarlandBooks.com. McFarland has a great baseball catalog, and it's also available at Amazon. So I hope readers take a look, and I really appreciate having a chance to talk with you today, Scott.
That was Phil Coffin. His book, A Baseball Book of Days, 31 Moments That Transform the Game, is out now. Coming on to close us out is Stephen Pelcman, reading the Commerce Comet from our 20th issue.
The Commerce Comet by Stephen Pelcman. He came to us from the Panhandle with the stink of prairie and zinc and lead and the roaring winds of Route 66, with the open Oklahoma wide spaces filled with nothing but the sweat of farmers and the dreams that fathers have for their sons. Under the glaring sun where native Indians had lived for centuries, where Bonnie and Clyde had murdered, Mickey had lived this small world in his father's shadow, destined to become a baseball god, with hands that gripped wood and stroked baseballs that traveled the distance that children could only imagine. Mantle waited in the shadows, hearing the roars and screams, and the men standing in rows and looking out across the field and stands that were larger than the mines and prairie grasses he was born into, but smaller than what the world expected of him. He walked to the plate carrying New York on his back, muscles bulging. He could feel his father's hands on his, feel the weight of an Oklahoma sun, hear the voices of Ruth and Garrick and Jolton Joe, and hit a ball that broke the darkness of sound. In a world of war and confusion, he was more than a baseball player, more than a reminder of the past. He was the hope forgotten in a new age when children still believed in heroes.
We talk to people in and around baseball literature every week on the podcast and publish around 50 writers every year in the Twin Bill Literary Journal. Until next time,